Welcome to The Riff, where writer and investor Byrne Hobart and I discuss the major inflection points caused by technological change. Our weekly conversation covers the obvious and not so obvious ways in which markets and businesses will adapt as a result. Let's jump right in. Shall we get to it?
Let's get to it.
Okay. Byrne, let's start this week by talking about antitrust. You wrote a little bit about a paradox within antitrust, and there's of course a lot been going on with Google and Microsoft and other companies as it relates to creative ways to navigate antitrust regulation. Why don't you unpack some of your thoughts on it?
Yeah, so I've been thinking about tech antitrust a lot and ended up actually sympathizing with Lina Khan more than I expected. Not that I really agree with her fundamental views, but the actual task is just really hard because what the growth strategy that a lot of tech companies in a lot of different spaces have pursued is that they maximize usage first, and then they have a lot of time to monetize once they have all the users and those users are producing data and everyone's pretty locked in. Like at that point, you're either consistently increasing ad load and getting better targeting, or you're consistently raising prices and people can't really say no. They're too locked into your software to actually do anything about it. So what that means though is that the time when it actually makes sense to go after a company that has excessive market power is before they're really using that market power to make a bunch of money. And that is also a time when they're generating a large and growing consumer surplus. So in retrospect, something like the launch of Chrome was actually a reason to seriously investigate Google and try to figure out, okay, should a search engine actually be able to own a browser? And if so, under what terms? Like, do we need to give everyone else a chance to have access to it? But also, it's really hard to come up with antitrust remedies that both reduce the market power of some big company and don't have the side effect of worsening the consumer experience. Because like the fundamental fact of search is that Google as a product is still really good. It gets better as more people use it. And so if once it has high market share, it is going to win by default. And there's a lot of effort involved in keeping it running and continuing to grow it. Like it's not like people, I mean, there is a reputation that you can coast a little more at Google than at other big tech companies, but there are still people doing useful things. There are still people who are trying to maintain and improve the product. And just at the scale at which they operate, there's a lot of work that has to be done just to have a functioning search engine. But I think the story of search competition kind of ended a very long time ago, and then maybe has hints of coming back due to AI search, but Google has also tried pretty hard to catch up on that. So yeah, if you care about the dominance of large companies, but you also care about consumer welfare, you're in a really tough position when the quality of their product is partly a function of the data that they have, and the data they have is partly a function of their market share. You basically have to choose one of those two priorities. And part of Lina Khan's earlier academic legal career was centered around saying we are actually going to choose to care about power rather than about immediate consumer welfare. And you can kind of hypothesize that eventually consumer welfare does get harmed by large and powerful companies. But I think that there are good reasons to question that view too, because if you have a company like Google, they're a huge company, they're making a ton of money, and they make that money from search, and they expect to be around for a really long time. They actually have a pretty pro-social incentive to just make the internet a better place. And they do that in like, there are definitely things that they do that make the internet a worse place, but they do invest in things like security and in pushing sites to be more secure. They bought Google Analytics. Was originally a paid product that was made by some other company. I think it was called Urchin, and they bought it and made it free and added a lot of new features. I think anyone who uses Google products as a power user has complaints, but every user of every product has complaints. So I will somewhat dismiss those and say if Google Analytics were not a great product, it would not be so ubiquitous. But when companies are doing that, like they are actually trying to make the world a better place, not because they're all really feel good altruists, but because the world, if it becomes a better place in general, some of that betterness is expressed by people spending more time online because the internet is a safer place to be and a better place to be, and spending more money online, and some of that money will end up producing more ad revenue for Google on either the display or search side. So they end up capturing enough of the positive externality that it is actually worth it for them to do really pro-social things. And so that sets up a really, really complicated position, or a really complicated situation for regulators, because essentially to say that that actually justifies a monopoly, or that that means that we shouldn't go after a monopoly, is basically to say that we cede some activities that we actually kind of morally consider the government's responsibility to a private organization that is actually, does actually have shareholders, is trying to maximize its earnings. And I think that's just something that a lot of people would be quite uncomfortable with. But I think you can turn that around and say that sometimes just the scope of responsibilities does change. Sometimes things that were private sector responsibilities become public sector responsibilities, and vice versa. That stuff like law enforcement in early modern England was a much more privatized thing, where you did have the state, it did play a role, but a fair amount of it was kind of done by freelancers. And that similarly, things like fire departments, they have a long history of being sometimes public, sometimes private, and either model can work. And sometimes just the shape of transaction cost changes in such a way that you say this now makes sense to privatize, or this no longer makes sense to privatize. And then even within the privatization question, there are these fuzzy boundaries, like to what extent is to what extent is like the global supply chain mostly a private sector thing, because the name of the entity that builds the factory in Shenzhen or owns the ship that moves things from Shenzhen to Los Angeles, like the entities that do that all have incorporated or LLC or partners or whatever in their name. So in one sense, they're private. On the other hand, it's hard to imagine that system working without the US military keeping ocean transit fairly safe, and without the US legal system enforcing contracts. So to some extent, it's like there's already this kind of fuzzy boundary. But I mean, when things change, it just gets more visible, and it becomes a more acute problem that you do have this tough trade-off to make. And I'm glad I'm not the person responsible for deciding, okay, if we made search 5% worse by some metric, but we also ensured that Bing and DuckDuckGo each have 10% market share and we'll probably be able to keep it, like, is that a win now? Is that a win eventually? Is that actually a net loss in all respects, because Google is still the main search engine, and also Google is slightly worse, and meanwhile, DuckDuckGo and Bing are better than they otherwise would be, but still, they just don't have enough data to be quite as good as Google. Yeah, I'm really glad that no one is asking me to make that decision, because I would very much not want to. But then you get rescued by another aspect of tech history, which is that the regulatory battles tend to happen on a long lag. Some of that is just the court system takes much longer than markets do, especially than tech company strategy does. Like, the circumstances change pretty fast while cases are still making their way through the legal system. So you've had situations like, IBM dealt with a lot of antitrust stuff over a period where IBM was actually losing its hold on the computer market. And similarly, Microsoft had all kinds of antitrust problems revolving around operating systems. And by the time all of that got more or less resolved, the operating system was becoming less important than the browser. And then they also lost their hold on the browser market. So, like, over time, these things do sometimes get taken care of. But then the problem with betting on that, so we're on the other handing many times over. But the problem with that is that at this point, all the tech CEOs have read plenty of books about tech history, and they like talking about tech history, and they like citing examples of, like, here's what happened in analog circuits in, the analog circuit market 30 years ago, and here's how that's an analogy to what's going on today, or whatever. So maybe they're all thinking about those exact problems and thinking to themselves, even if we win this case, the actual problem is someone starting a company in a garage that makes our whole category obsolete, or at least weakens its market power. So they are probably trying to address that. So yeah, you can, I think any strong view on just the default of, do you break up powerful companies or do you let them do whatever they want, is probably going to not age very well. But the weakly held view of market dominance in tech is a very temporary thing. And if you look at the most important companies far enough back in the past, then you see a totally different list than today. Like, that's probably getting less true. In fact, that is empirically getting less true. Like, if you ask someone to name what are the most important tech companies circa 2014, they'd give you a list that is very similar to the list you get today. Like, maybe Microsoft would be lower on the list, but the fact that Microsoft was lower on the list for a while and then became a much more important and much more powerful tech company again after, under Satya, that does tell you that these companies are conscious of the ongoing existential risks that they face, and they are increasingly trying to address those.
So Lina Khan, underrated.
Well, she has an underrated, like the difficulty of the problem she has is underrated. That if you do actually care about if you care about concentration of power per se, for any entity that's not the federal government, then and then you also care about consumer welfare, like at best, she can pursue one policy aim at the cost of really annoying a bunch of people who just notice that the search experience is visibly degraded from where it was a few years ago. And I'm sure that if tech companies start taking serious losses on the regulatory front, they will probably be even less shy about saying that that is exactly what happened and exactly who's at fault. Like a lot of people still go to google.com. Google will sometimes put some kind of message there about a major issue. Like I think they did that for net neutrality a while back, a decade plus back, but they did it. Uber, when they were worried about taxi regulations in New York, they offered a de Blasio mode in their app where it was much more expensive and much slower and the car was worse. And so like some of these companies are just not afraid to lobby in their own interests. And they may get more aggressive about that if they see regulation as a bigger threat than competition or just potential consumer indifference.
And so if she came to you and said, "Hey, Byrne, I'll do anything you tell me to do. Give me advice." What would that be?
What would that be? So I think the idea that seems like the most plausible way to reduce the power of any one company, but also not degrade the user experience, is to require companies to open up more of their private APIs. And it's really hard to negotiate exactly what that looks like. But like if you could have a search engine where the organic results are powered by one provider and the ads are powered by someone else, and you can do your own distribution deals, like that does exist to some extent, and it used to exist a lot more. And like Google does have these white label deals, but if it were a kind of mandatory thing where there is some kind of common carrier requirement for certain internal APIs, then that might actually push things in a direction where at least you don't have to do the full stack search experience to actually have a viable competing search engine. But honestly, I think the thing to bet on is that these companies are trying to compete with one another. They do see it as a strategic risk that Google controls search and controls a lot of the browser market, and that Apple and Google have split up the App Store. So maybe the optimal framework for this is you're sort of arming the moderate rebels, where you basically try to give a lot of leeway to otherwise anti-competitive behaviors from companies that are going after somebody else's monopoly. So I think that framework probably gets you closest to just trying to keep the tech market dynamic enough that companies are still rising and falling. Instead of like, we do have companies rising, we have fewer companies falling than used to be the case. And so that is, from the perspective of an investor, that's a great thing. It does mean that you have been able to do very well for a very long time, just passively owning the five or so biggest tech companies. Like that's been a great trade for a really long time. But I think it does kind of mess with the ecosystem. Like you sort of you want circumstances to be such that there is a next IBM, in the sense of a once completely dominant, like overwhelmingly terrifying tech company that is simply irrelevant to the average company's decisions today. And we just don't have that. Like we haven't had anyone have a big decline and fall.
Hey everybody, Erik here with a word from our sponsors. Fast forward to the end of 2024. Think about your goals. What can you do right now to give yourself the best chance of succeeding? If learning a new language is on your list, you absolutely need to check out Babbel. Babbel offers a range of learning tools, self-study app lessons, live classes, and even podcasts, which have always been my favorite way to learn. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel isn't just a game to kill time and make you feel like you're learning a language. It's not overly academic or rigid either. It's all about learning language for the real world. Babbel stands out because it's designed by real people using a modern conversational teaching approach. It's not always easy, nothing worth doing ever is, but it's straightforward and designed to help you start speaking in just 3 weeks. With Babbel, I was able to brush up on my intermediate Spanish to ramp up for travel to Argentina last year, and was able to set clear goals based on how much time each week I wanted to practice. Join millions of Babbel language learners across all age groups. Here's a special limited time offer for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners, at babbel.com/zen. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/zen. spelled BABBEL.com/Zen. Rules and restrictions may apply. The tech world turns to the Brave browser for its unbeatable privacy protections. But did you know that Brave also has a private ad platform? Brave Ads offers first-party targeting, and it's been cookieless since day one, so you can relax while third-party tracking cookies disappear from the web. Today, millions of people turn to ad blockers to avoid being tracked and pestered online. But Brave's new ad model aligns incentives for users and advertisers. Users earn rewards for viewing ads, which they can save, spend, or pass along to their favorite creators. And advertisers score points for respecting user privacy, generating ROI without invasive tracking. So whether it's high-impact announcements on the new tab page or keyword-targeted ads in Brave Search offers diverse, private, future-proof ad formats for all your business goals. Join the future of advertising at brave.com/ads. Mention Turpentine to get 25% off your first campaign.
There was someone who wrote a book a few years ago who talked about another idea you mentioned in your opening around this idea that private companies are now doing more and more of what the government used to do, whether it's healthcare or just other services. What are your thoughts? We have private companies paying for, covering the costs of healthcare, for fertility, sometimes of, sort of parental leave. Like, what are your, is this actually a pretty good thing and should continue? Or what do you think about this broader trend around sort of what private companies cover versus what the government covers?
Yeah, I think so a lot of these larger tech companies, like Google in particular, it feels kind of like Norway, where it is this sort of nice, gentle society. People tend to get along and everyone has a pretty high standard of living. And the reason for that is that you have this money gusher that, like in Google's case, it was very much more that they they built a good product and then have been able to defend that product against challenges. But so, it's a little bit of an unfair comparison, but given that very few people who are at Google today played a meaningful role in getting Google to the point where it was large enough that it would always have more data than the next best search engine. And so it didn't have to actually have the best algorithms. And my understanding is that a lot of the major search engines kind of see themselves as being at close to parity in terms of the quality of their algorithms, where like if you used Bing's algorithm but gave them all of Google's traffic and vice versa, that Bing would not immediately be a better search engine, but they would be better at catching up on the algorithm side than Google would be at catching up on the data side if you had them switch market shares. So yeah, I on the question of like privatizing things that are considered government obligations, like to some extent that has always happened. An example of this that people find really unfair, that is basically an older iteration of corporate ESG, is that it used to be a social norm in the mid 20th century that slowly went away, that companies would care about the marital status of employees, and that in particular, if a woman got married, she would lose her job. If a man got married and had kids, he would probably get a raise. And this is sort of like a paternalistic but also patriarchal welfare state, where they're basically saying, we think that the default configuration for a family is dad works at the office, provides for the entire family, mom is at home, and they basically arrange their hiring on the assumption that that's just how things work. And if everyone buys into that and everyone thinks that's a really healthy social norm, then of course companies are going to implement it. And to the extent that companies don't buy into that, or that people don't like it, then there's going to be selection against it. So that's probably what you're seeing, is that there is sort of like I guess one way to think about it is like there is a conception of what the welfare state would be like that people in the San Francisco Bay Area have. Like the median Bay Area resident probably wants a more generous welfare state. They probably do want things like subsidized IVF. They probably do want long parental leave. They're probably okay with having less economic upside in exchange for those things. And if you have enough companies that are all competing to hire talent in that area, and that's just what that population wants, and the companies are in a good enough business that they can actually afford to behave that way, then that is pretty much what you get. So you sort of get a recreation of what Henry Ford tried to do with his early hiring practices, where he paid people pretty well, but he would also audit their lifestyles. He'd have employees of Ford visit the homes of Ford assembly line workers and just see if it looked like their kids are, dressed, being bathed regularly, being fed, not being beaten. I think IBM for a long time had a very strong norm against alcohol, and there was like this sea change one time late in the tenure of Thomas Watson Sr., where they had a big meeting for executives and they actually served wine. And it was like the first time that there had been alcohol at an IBM event in the company's history, or at least that it had been allowed officially in the company's history. So like sometimes companies they adopt a set of social norms, they have a really good business, and so they can actually afford to pay the cost of those norms. And then it becomes really appealing for people who, if in an ideal world, they would just live in a country that had that kind of welfare state and was wealthy enough to afford it. That ideal world does not exist, but you can basically opt into that world by working at one of the big tech companies.
Yeah, that makes sense. I want to segue into another thing we wrote about, AI trust, and what happens when it's so much easier to generate fake images and videos. What are second order effects and implications of that?
Yeah, so I think one of the ways to think about that is to note that we have been able to generate fake text for a really long time. So you can just type whatever you want into, a word processor, into an email, into Twitter. And so we already have this expectation that if someone types out something really, really ludicrous, that you are either going to assume that it's fictional, or you're going to assume that it's not, a story they're telling for entertainment, but they're actually trying to lie. And you sort of judge that, but also you would judge the person who's saying it, and if they're in a position where that could have actually happened to them, then maybe the story is a bit more credible. So I think we'll end up applying a lot of that thinking to things like images and videos. That if someone shows you, I don't know, some really photo of some really shocking scene at the Democratic convention, you will ask yourself, is this the kind of person who would just ask Grok to make this photo, or is this actually the kind of person who would have taken this photo, would have been in a position to do it, and would have honestly described the circumstances behind it. But I think the second order effect there is, once we know that it's pretty easy to fabricate content, we might start thinking about the more labor intensive ways that people have been able to fabricate things in the past, which would be things like you get a bunch of transcripts of basically everything some public figure has said. You look for interesting phrases and sentences. You strip them of their context, and then you post the clip somewhere. And, careers have been ruined over statements that people made that were actually pretty innocuous in context, but you drop the sentence or two before what they said, or you clip out something in the middle, and suddenly it sounds really, really bad. And for whatever reason, there is kind of this, I think, tacit acceptance of this at a lot of major media companies, that it is in fact okay to deliberately mislead people if you are misleading them about the specific thing that happened, but you are telling them something about the character of the person involved in this thing. Um, so it's kind of, what is it, fake but accurate, I think was the original term that was coined for this one. And like, there are things that are fake but accurate, where if you told me a story about how you did business with Donald Trump, and that you had worked for him for a while, and he promised you some amount of money, and then he came up with some weird excuse not to pay, like, the fact that you made it up doesn't.
Yeah, or some sort of crypto coin experiment that maybe he was going to do.
Yeah, like a lot of those, they do make perfect sense. Like it's even though you might be fabricating that story, like it's not a huge deal. But I think it's still good to hold yourself to a standard where if you believe that someone has a particular trait and you can't think of a single example of it, but you can make up an example, then you might be wrong about them having that trait. You might have just gotten a vibe from somebody else who also got a vibe from somebody else, and so on. But like within large media organizations, the thing I've been thinking about a lot is that if they show a misleading clip of some public figure saying something that is not actually what they said, not actually what they meant, and they add commentary as if that is in fact exactly what they meant, someone somewhere in that process had to deliberately choose to deceive the audience. They had to think that they had to know what actually happened, decide they were not going to tell the audience that, and they also had to believe that their audience would not actually question it. And so I think as we get more aware of that dynamic, it actually puts a higher premium on being just deliberately over honest, and, over disclosing conflicts of interest and trying to give as much context as possible. It does make things kind of boring and annoying to read, because especially if you're writing about a contentious issue, people have an opinion, and they tend to treat their opinion as kind of the middle of the road view. And so you tend to look, if you are a centrist, you look like an extremist to both sides. So it can be really annoying to actually consume that kind of content. But if you if you are getting this sense of this person is, like maybe directionally on my side, but they're actually really good at criticizing my side, and they brought up things I didn't know that were deficiencies in my arguments, even though they do net agree with them more than they agree with the other side's arguments. Like, I think at some point that is really the only credible signal that you have left, that this person is actually being honest. There's a brief discussion on Twitter months ago about the question of how do you edit a quote, and in particular, is it way too fussy to put, if you are quoting part of a sentence, but the part of the sentence you're quoting is actually, it could function as a complete sentence. Is it weirdly fussy to capitalize the first letter of the first word of that sentence, but put it in brackets to indicate that you edited it? And my view is, when you do that, you're telling people, I will always disclose the way I modified text, even if it's completely irrelevant. I will never just quote something and you'll have to go back and look at, what did this person actually say? What did they probably really mean by this? Like, I think that kind of signal, even though, of course, someone who's totally dishonest could also do that, it is a useful signal. It's also one of those ritual reminders to yourself that if you are trying to write about the world, and if people are reading your writing or they're listening to what you have to say, they implicitly trust you somewhat, and that it's just a really obnoxious and very morally bad thing to knowingly abuse that trust and give them more confidence in what is probably an opinion they share with you, more confidence in that than is warranted. Like, you really don't want a society where all of the like average people are pretty much true believers in one ideology or another, and then everyone who's actually in a position to affect that ideology and speak on behalf of it doesn't actually think it's nearly as valid as their fans do. You don't want like the maximum fanatics in charge of everything, but you also don't want it to be the case that there's like this gradient of cynicism, and that the closer you get to the most powerful people, the more you have people who basically never say anything that they actually believe.
Speaking more broadly around AI, you also wrote this idea that if you'd have described the technical inputs into AI sufficiently long ago, it would have sounded like you were explaining why it could never be created. So what takeaway do you have from that, or why is that the case?
So my understanding is that this is not the only reason that neural networks were unfashionable for a long time. But for a while, people would just run the numbers on, okay, how much RAM do you need, and how much processing power do you actually need to train a neural network to do something interesting? And they'd always get to these implausibly vast numbers and be like, okay, so this is a theoretical construct. It is an interesting bit of math, but it's not actually something you could ever use to create artificial intelligence. It's a dead end. We should train expert systems, have a long list of concepts and all of the relationships between those concepts, and traverse those in a deterministic way, and we'll end up with a machine that thinks. Which to me also sounds more like a way you'd get a machine that thinks, because that is kind of, when you talk to kids, when you're teaching them things, you're often taking analogies to things they already know, and then explaining how something else is similar, and then explaining how it's different. The kind of brute force approach of, we're going to build these massive arrays of very simple little digital neurons, and they, like, none of them will be individually smart, but collectively they will end up developing algorithms that do approximate what humans do, and they'll eventually get better. Like, that is a really inelegant way to think about intelligence, but it's also the way that actually works so far. So it did turn out to be true. But part of the reason I was thinking about that was that there are a lot of historical cases where, if you were describing the growth of some industry in advance, it would actually sound like you were explaining how implausible it is that this industry could come into existence. So, like, take cars. When the first internal combustions were made, and the first internal combustion engines were developed in the late 19th century, there was just not enough oil for everyone. There's not enough oil being produced for everyone to drive a car. And it actually wasn't clear if the world had enough oil for everyone to do that for more than a couple of years before we just ran out. It did turn out there was a whole lot more oil under the ground than we had anticipated, and that we still seem to have roughly plenty, like roughly enough to get to whatever the next big energy source turns out to be. But I think it's a generally useful exercise to do that kind of extrapolation and just ask, okay, what, is it actually possible that we can just keep going in this direction for a really long time? What would have to be true if that's the case? And is it like definitively true that we run into some wall, or is it just like, it's an implausible amount of compounding growth, but that is the rate at which that thing has been compounding for a while. So we can kind of treat it as reasonably likely, or we can at least treat it as within the realm of possibility that it just keeps on compounding in that direction for a long time. Now, that works really well in AI, and it just turns out that semiconductors are very amenable to long-term efficiency gains, and that it is just absurd how much complexity goes into making, say, the chip in my newish MacBook Pro. But it can be done, and there's a very large financial incentive to do it. It's still physically possible. We are bumping into more and more of the limitations of physics in that particular kind of case, but we're also getting a lot better at doing some things in parallel and at figuring out what has to be computed on the fly, what can be computed and then cached. And like even within AI, there is this interesting thesis that I've found pretty compelling, which is that when you add parameters to a model, like the model does tend to get better performance, but it's also more expensive to run. But what you can do is you can use a very large general purpose model to create a bunch of synthetic training data in some narrow domain. The model is powerful enough that the data is pretty good. You use the synthetic data to train a single purpose model. And right now we have these like massively multi-purpose models where if you go to Amazon, they have their little shopping assistant. You can tell it like, hey, I'm trying to write an operating system in Scheme. Can you help me out? And it will happily do that. It's a general purpose model. That model would be cheaper to run if it were only trained on Amazon product descriptions, and if all it could talk about is those, and it completely flaked out if you asked it anything outside of that domain, or just gave you, random information outside of that domain. So that is a case where it's like a software efficiency that offsets the eventual just inevitable flattening of hardware efficiencies. And it does mean that there's still room for a lot more deployment of existing technologies where they work, but they might be too expensive to be practical in some domains. But you can actually build a more inexpensive version that is actually practical in a lot of other spaces.
That makes sense. I want to talk about another piece that you wrote about, which is this. Well, actually, and just to summarize, you call this the absurdity heuristic, right?
Yes. Yeah, the absurdity heuristic is like you look at someone's business plan and you say, well, your business would only break even if like everyone in America decided to buy a smartphone. And then they're like, okay, well, it turns out that's true. There are a lot of businesses where they exist today, they make sense today, they're profitable today. And there is some year at which if you described what has to happen for that business to work, that would be the way that you dismiss that as a non-viable business.
Yeah, is you right? It's a way to sanity check the sanity check.
Yes.
Yeah. I want to go to this other fascinating piece you wrote about around capital and this idea that the world has a lot more capital than you think because most of it is intangible. Why don't you explain that?
Yes, this arose from my paranoid delusion that an intellectually consistent communist would want to nationalize my toothbrush. And it is so the toothbrush example is something that people like Marxist writers who are writing about how you would implement an actual communist system. One of the concerns that they get is, are you just going to nationalize all of my stuff? Like, are you going to come to my house, take all of my things, and then redistribute them? And their answer is no, we're not actually going to do that. That in their worldview, they describe this distinction between personal property and capital. And they do want to nationalize capital, but they don't want to nationalize personal property. But when I was thinking about that and just the nature of capital, it occurred to me that something like a toothbrush or pots and pans in a kitchen, it is a form of capital. Like it is an asset, it's a durable asset. You pay for it once, it produces some return for you over time in combination with labor. Now there is a Marxist counter argument, which is it's your labor, not somebody else's. So you're not really exploiting yourself, or maybe you are. I guess I suppose there are flavors of anarchism where they would say that if you are doing extra work, more work than you need to survive, then you are in some sense exploiting yourself. But I think it's like a side case. But there are just a lot of things that people buy or own that have this function of being like capital. They are like a substitute for capital. You can even imagine cases where someone is considering, for example, should I use a laundromat or should I buy a nice washer and dryer in my apartment? And they might actually run the numbers, hypothetically, if this person's just really insistent on min-maxing every aspect of their life, except how much time they spend in Excel modeling minor personal financial decisions. Like they could say, okay, I can put X amount of money into the S&P and it will generate roughly this amount of capital gains over time. And the cost of using the laundromat is Y, and my capital gets a higher return if I buy index funds and outsource my laundry than if I save money on laundry, but have this big capital investment upfront to do that. So like it to me, it doesn't make sense that you'd say that a washer and dryer, they are capital if the laundromat owns them, and the S&P index fund position you bought is also capital if you own it, or it is like a claim, it's a financial claim on physical capital if you own it, but it's not capital if you have exactly the same economics, but you're doing more of the work yourself and you own the asset yourself. So I think in that sense, you sort of broaden the definition of capital and say we have a lot of productive assets just in our homes that do throw off some stream of returns. It's not market returns. It's not denominated in money, but it is something that is in effect, you could denominate it in money because you can look at what you'd have to pay. If you had no ability to cook food, you're spending a lot more money on DoorDash, and therefore you can treat the gap between what you'd spend door dashing every single meal and how much it costs to cook meals at home. You can treat that as like the dividend that your stove and your pots and pans are paying you every meal. But then you can broaden this further and say there are other forms of capital that are even more intangible. Like if you look at that S&P index fund, it does not trade at book value. It actually trades at a premium to book value. And there's a reason that companies are worth more than the liquidation value of their assets. That reason is that the company has some intangible assets that don't show up on the balance sheet, like the brand name, but they also have like organizational capital. People are just able to do more work if they know each other, like each other, if they've been slotted into the correct career paths, if people who weren't a fit for the company went somewhere else, if people who were a good fit for the company got promoted quickly, etc. And then there are other forms of even more intangible capital, like participating in the dollar-based economy, where like pretty much everyone in the world is denominating their money, first in local currency and secondarily in dollars. Dollars are just like the universal way that you would transact with anyone who does not use your local currency. And then for Americans, much like our relationship to English, which I think is the other big intangible asset, like for Americans, it's just like that, except we actually default to dollars. So we don't even have to mentally translate things into other currencies. And English is the other big one where it just has incredibly powerful network effects. Like it is, probably not the language you design from first principles, but it's been a pretty viral product over time. And as it gets more viral, like as more people opt to learn English as their second language, the volume of English language content goes up. And so the value of learning more English also goes up. So this is a just enormously valuable asset. Like I can't imagine how much money I would pay to, how much money I would pay to avoid losing the ability to speak English. Like I'm sure I could get by in French, German, Spanish, Japanese, whatever, but I feel like there's just a lot of cultural capital that's embodied in the English language, and it's a really valuable asset to have. And then, returning to this original question of nationalizing the assets, sharing them more broadly, to the extent that those are the really valuable assets, the socialist revolution has actually already happened. It's just very unevenly distributed, and that the higher your income is, the more you're probably tapping into these unowned and unownable assets. So, the more of the world's stock of just freely available mathematical knowledge that you have personally internalized and can apply towards useful ends, the more you know about various open source programming languages and various open source projects, the more likely it is that you have a really, really high income and do not have to do very much backbreaking work to get that high income. So to that extent, like people, I guess returning to our earlier discussion of like, you don't have the welfare state you'd love to have, but you can opt into it by getting that job at Apple or Meta or something. People in those jobs are also sort of living in this semi-social, in a very abstract sense, like this socialized economy where there is this communal asset that we're all just using and that we're all contributing to. So everyone who opts into using English and uses their English skills to communicate with people they otherwise would not communicate with, to write things that they otherwise would not write, that are read by people who would otherwise not read them. All these people are increasing the value of that asset. So we're actually behaving in this sort of post-greed ideal way, but only with respect to these broadly owned assets that don't show up on anyone's balance sheet and they're basically impossible to value from a financial perspective.
Balaji just announced his first network state experiment this past week. And it'll be interesting to see in either his or other sort of experiments like this, how many of the intangible assets will be sort of, transferable or will be able to, be created when starting from scratch in some ways.
Yeah, I think the concept of network state is really interesting. I think there are definitely cases where it is just an optimal way to organize people. And one of my concerns is like nation states are powerful. They're also very, they're very jealous. They don't like the existence of things that threaten their power. And they do have a lot of resources, even if they're very, very inefficient. I think dealing with the U.S. Department of Defense operating at 1% efficiency is still a pretty risky proposition. Like you need a pretty serious budget and a lot of organizational chops to be able to, even if you're operating at 100% efficiency, to be able to deal with that. I don't expect the network state to be invaded by, to be stormed by Marines anytime soon, or to get drone struck or whatever. But what I do think you'd want to think about with respect to the network state is, okay, if you make exit cheaper, and that does mean that people are constantly sorting themselves into the right institution for them, you also make it harder for network states to make decisions that are costly for their members in the short term and deliver benefits in the long run. You can find workarounds for that. And in fact, the private sector is the classic case where exit, like private sector in the US at least, exit very, very cheap. You can just send someone an email and say, I quit as of now. If you're polite about it, you say, I quit as of whatever my notice period is, but it's not like you get hauled into court if you just leave. So we do have cheap exit, but that also means that a lot of companies go to pretty great lengths to ensure that people stick around, whether that is things like paying them partly in those same perks that you mentioned, because those are hard. They're incommensurate with just cash. Like it's hard for someone to figure out, okay, Google, feeds me, does my laundry, maybe Palantir gives me housing subsidies there, and then I like my coworkers, etc. So they're like all of these reasons that are just a little bit hard to compare. They make it a little bit harder to say this job, it pays 20% more than what I'm getting now, but really when I factor in the psychic value of Taco Tuesday with my friends, maybe it's more like a 10% premium, and maybe that's not quite worth it. So they do try to have lock in that way, and then the other way to get lock in is through some combination of deferred comp and non compete agreements. And in places that where non competes have been historically more enforceable, they are a big part of it. But even like in finance, there's a lot of funds and other companies. They try to have people's compensation be as deferred as they can make it, so that if someone does quit, they're actually leaving a lot of money on the table. And if someone wants to hire that person, they're either that person's taking an immediate financial hit and they hope they make money back later, or the new employer is actually basically buying out whatever that deferred bonus was, and then they're taking the immediate hit and hoping this person sticks around. But when they do that, they're thinking to themselves, okay, what if this person quits this job in 18 months? So we need to have an even more aggressive deferral where it's even more unaffordable to poach them. So organizations are always trying to come up with ways to raise the cost of exit, even in an environment where exit by default is very cheap. And I think you could actually end up seeing network states try to do that. Hopefully the way that works is like, if you exit this network state, you lose some fraction of the crypto token that's, some of your locked tokens just expire worthless and you don't get them. And it's not like, okay, you've ingested this nanobot, and if you leave our network state, it will kill you kill you in the next 10 seconds. But that's also an option. And maybe if your network state is very lax on regulations on medical experiments, it ends up with an extremely loyal population because no one can actually leave. But I think that while the existence of such a specific network state is probably very bad for the people involved in it, at least most of them, the possibility of having different legal arrangements and just different ways to institutionalize and talk about the fact that people sometimes need to cooperate, and that companies and families and cities are just not the only units of cooperation. I think that's a good thing, and it's probably I'm very much in the non-ironic let a thousand flowers bloom phase of this, where I think we should experiment a lot more with different systems of governance, a lot more with different systems of contract enforcement and norms enforcement. I think it's hard to do that within a given nation state, and then the nation states do tend to get kind of worried when the experiment works well and there's someone who's on their land but not completely under their legal system, who is getting wealthy and powerful enough to potentially take a little bit more space later on.
Of nation states being competitive. I thought one of the most interesting things from the Peter Thiel Joe Rogan interview, aside from his hypothesis that Bill Gates sort of work on COVID and with his foundation was a way to doing great work, was a way to potentially make it so that his ex-wife Melinda Gates had less of a claim to half of his fortune. Besides that theory, which I thought was very interesting and potentially plausible, I thought his theory on why nuclear has stalled out. He said basically as a way to stall out nuclear, basically nukes in general, and he thought sort of the risk of other countries having nuclear power plants maybe made it so that we couldn't regulate their sort of advancement of nuclear capabilities more broadly. And the idea of us creating a ton of regulations around nukes and then nuclear power plants and then other countries copying ours maybe had the benefit of ensuring just more global stability, even if it meant at the cost of advancing nuclear energy.
I think it's fair to say that it worked out that way, that we would probably have more countries with nuclear weapons if nuclear power plants were as cheap as they seem to be on track to be. I think the timing doesn't quite work. So I think if you tell stories about the US showing a lot of state capacity and a lot of foresight and coordinating across a lot of different groups within the government, I think those stories are really, really plausible in the 1930s and in the 1940s. They get less plausible in the 50s and 60s. And then from the 70s onward, I just don't think they work. So I think if nuclear power plants had started out cheap and then instantly got just wildly expensive, you could imagine a case where someone at the state, some really, really smart person in the State Department was thinking about this and kind of running the numbers on nuclear proliferation and figuring out what the inputs were. And then they also wanted to figure out, okay, what is the most deniable way that we can stop this from happening? Well, we could ask the nuclear regulators, like the regulators of civilian nuclear power plants, to just create a bunch of arbitrarily onerous rules. But given that it happened later, my default bet, like whenever the government does something really, complicated and weird, and like one side's doing one thing and another side's doing another thing, like if FDR is telling them both what to do, it may be some grand conspiracy. But if they exist under, say, the Bush administration, it's probably just they have no idea who the other person in the government is. They have no idea what the competing interests are. If they knew, they simply wouldn't care. They want job security, and they know that they don't look bad if the US has more gas and more coal than it counterfactually would. They look really, really bad if there is a meltdown and a lot of people die or develop obscure cancers because they let someone skimp on something. So I would lean towards that explanation, just given the timing that nuclear did start to get more expensive, more like in the 70s onward, and it seemed to be getting cheaper earlier on. And I think there are also just external factors where power generation was a growth business in the US, and like I think until about the 1960s. And after that, it really, really leveled off. And a lot more of the action and excitement has been about increasing efficiency and replacing old plants with newer and better run ones that are cleaner, etc., versus actually radically increasing the availability of energy. Energy use per capita has not been growing at the pace that it once did, and some of that is efficiency, and some of that is that costs were dropping for a long time and then stopped dropping.
Thinking about just time here, I'm going to segue quickly. You wrote about how platforms that are nervous about politics and porn will sometimes offer both to users who are looking for them, but maybe not go out of their way to make that content broadly available. Why don't you talk about that tension?
Yeah, so I think it's probably negative expected value for any social network to let people talk about politics, because you either end up with a social network that has a really strong partisan reputation, or you end up with a social network where people who thought they liked each other learn who the other person is going to vote for this year and decide they actually hate each other. And so, Facebook wants people my age to be sharing baby pictures. They do not want people my age to be ending friendships over, I don't know, no tax on tips or grocery store price gouging or whatever the issue of the day is. And what I think they found was that in the short term, political content massively increases engagement. And then in the long term, it just turns social media into more of a chore and more of a hostile environment. So the more long-term focused they are, the less they want to have that kind of content. But they also recognize that political views are an important part of people's lives, that it is something people talk about with their friends, that they often have like a bubble of more politically aligned friends who they talk a lot about politics with, and then maybe people they're happy to argue with and won't end up despising. I've heard of far fewer cases where someone had a real life friendship that actually ended over political differences than I have heard of cases of someone blocked one of their high school classmates on Facebook for some lame political reason. But since they recognize that this is actually just a feature of human beings, that we like this stuff, what they want to do is have a way that you can access it if that is the specific thing that you're trying to get, and otherwise not really put it in front of you. And so you could actually imagine, in the same way that sites can have like a not safe for work toggle, they could actually add a toggle for just like politics, culture war, etc., and default that toggle off. So you just don't really hear about that stuff. But then if you search for, I don't know, Harris price gouging or something, you find what you're looking for. And I think that's probably a pretty inevitable system. And then Reddit is a really interesting case because they used to have much more of a political reputation. I was looking back at historical Reddit front pages, and there were days where like 10 of the top 25 stories were just Ron Paul stuff. And that's a lot for someone who did not break double digits in primary campaigns and has been a political gadfly for a really long time. So for a while, that was like Reddit was just this very, very libertarian, very, very atheist kind of site. And now it's like, it probably still leans that way, but it's not quite that anymore. And one reason for that is that they create these sub communities. Those communities can create their own norms. So you can have very left-leaning and very right-leaning communities on the same site. And if someone is signing up for the subreddits that they're interested in, that's the content that they're going to see. So from the perspective of a conservative, Reddit ends up being a very conservative site where there are sometimes like random progressive blips on the front page, but not very many of them, and it's not enough to ruin your day. And similarly for progressive, like Reddit is a bubble of progressive viewpoints, and there's the occasional thing that escapes containment from Trump world, and they can kind of dismiss it. So I think that setup does mean that Reddit is like a good destination for platforms that are really averse to making the moderation decisions themselves, but also recognize that users want the content. And I think that's potentially going to be a growing part of Google's relationship with Reddit. Is like, okay, we know that you're going to look up political news and stuff. We don't want you actually interacting with other users. Like, we don't want you arguing in YouTube comments about who you're going to vote for, etc. It's just low quality content. But we will let you go on Reddit and argue about that stuff to your heart's content. And then Reddit has just different zones where different things are allowed or disallowed, and it all seems to kind of work. It does mean that Reddit ends up being this load-bearing feature of the internet ecosystem, and it's a big responsibility for them, but they also generate a lot of fresh, unique tokens that are great for training AI, so they end up getting paid for it one way or another.
I do coincidentally end up seeing a lot more politics and porn on my X feed. Although, of course, that's no reflection on me. That's just what Elon wants us to see. But it also it is interesting to see how Elon Twitter has led to more of that.
Yeah. I mean, he fired a lot of moderation staff, and I'm sure some of them were just, very biased and things, but others were actually identifying like, okay, this ad is clearly from an OnlyFans person. It is obviously promoting an OnlyFans. It's a very sexual ad. We shouldn't be running this ad. There is some OnlyFans creator who I see this person's ads a lot, and every time there's a community note saying this is not allowed by the X terms of service. Presumably, I see these ads a lot because I interacted with the ad by tapping on the community note, because I was like, surely someone has pointed out that this is just an ad for porn, and I thought X didn't allow that. And yes, that had happened, but maybe the recommendation algorithm says, well, this person, he's close, he's moved down the funnel one step. There is some engagement, so let's just continue showing him this ad indefinitely. And I think X just also, Musk seems more personally libertarian and libertine than a lot of other tech CEOs. He also hasn't been running a platform for all that long. And I feel like a lot of the people who run, the people who are running Reddit or running Facebook, etc., they have a lot of battle scars. Like, they've seen a lot of stuff, and they've been yelled at by a lot of people, and they've had to apologize to both sides for how biased they are many, many times. Like, Facebook, I think since probably 2012, but certainly since 2016, they have been persistently apologizing for having been too conservative to the progressives and too progressive to the conservatives. So I think they, like, the more established sites that have just been through this for a long time, they just recognize it is such a headache to annoy people in this respect. And that it is so much easier to run a PG-13 site than to run an R or X rated site. So that is just the commercially viable decision. And I think Musk, like a lot of people who interact with the product, were like, this is lame. They're not letting us see the cool stuff. They're not letting, you recognize these rules when they get in your way. So your experience is always that a site's moderation is overbroad, unless it's a bunch of people dogpiling you over something, in which case your perception is, no, this site is not nearly moderated enough. And I think Musk is still closer to that viewpoint than to the viewpoint of someone who has had every single person accuse them of being biased, and has even had people, like, I'm sure if you do this long enough, like if you've been a Twitter person for long enough, you've probably had Candace Owens tell you you are in the pocket of the right wingers, and she, as a progressive activist, is not going to stand for it. And now it's a completely different view. But my guess is that her views on the unfairness of Twitter's moderation have actually been like the only stable part of her political evolution.
Yeah. It's interesting. Elon, you mentioned Libertine. He had a sort of, remember he was like Vox Populi, Vox Day. He had like this democratic streak. He, did a poll around should he step down, and I don't think he followed the results of that poll. But we haven't, or the right hasn't been good at creating a new establishment. It's mostly good at just pushing back. For example, like, Elon took away all the verified, or changed the verification so that as to make it meaningless, just whoever pays for it. But what he could have done is made, the new Ezra Klein is now Mike Solana. Like, he could have just said, okay, now the journalists that are verified are sort of, more counter elite. Similarly, like, people complain about Wikipedia being, a tool of the establishment, and people want to take it, make it more fair, take it down. It's rare that they're like, okay, let's create our own version of that has, pirate wires as like the equivalent of New York Times or whatever it is.
Some of it is that there is a deeper talent bench on the left, particularly for content creation. And I think, like, there are some just cultural norm differences in conservative and liberal circles. And there's also just the fact that a lot of the jobs that give you a lot of influence early on, that put you on a track to be the very influential thinker over time, they're not compatible with actually having kids and raising a family, unless you have a lot of family money. So, if you're asking who can afford to move to New York and work at Vox and do that for many, many years before they actually earn enough money to genuinely live in New York, much less before they earn enough money to live in New York in their own apartment that is large enough to have more than, a child. It's the people who have an easier time doing that are the ones who are not going to have kids for a while. And it is just more of a cultural norm in conservative circles to have kids early and often. So you do just naturally end up with just way more progressives who are working in those fields and who are contributing to Wikipedia, for example. So I think that is something you should just expect by default. There are cases where conservatives have built an elite, and one example is the Federalist Society, where it is really good at getting conservatives jobs in law and making sure their legal career goes smoothly. In fact, if you are really ambitious in law, it does actually make sense to pretend to be conservative rather than progressive, because a lot of the positions that are available, it is like closer to 50-50, that like half the time a conservative judge gets appointed by a conservative president, half the time a liberal judge gets appointed by a liberal, and so on. And if law school is not 50-50, which it's definitely not, your conditional odds of getting the clerkship are just way, way higher if you pretend to be conservative. Now, I don't know if there's any actual recorded case of someone doing that. There are plenty of cases where people are like conservative when they're writing essays, but their lifestyle is very blue state. And I think that's just something that conservatives kind of have to deal with and have to expect, is that their elites are just their elites are, at least in terms of lifestyle, going to act to the left of the people they represent. And then progressives have exactly the same issue, where their elites are also, at least I don't know that the politicians, but certainly their staffers are way to the left of the median Democrat. But that is just part of the structure of any kind of system where you do require young people to work in jobs that pay more in prestige than status, is that those jobs they pay more in prestige and status than in money. the people who select into those jobs are people who have less of a need for money. They find getting rich less appealing, or they're not going to need to pay for daycare and private school. So of course it's going to select for more progressive stuff. And I have my modest proposal on introducing more equality into these systems is that for people who are in high prestige jobs, we just offer them a vastly more generous child tax credit, such that you can actually afford to live in Washington, D.C., working as an intern for a think tank, and have 3 or 4 kids because you're actually making more money from your tax credits than you are from your job. I don't think that's going to fly. I think the kind of people who find the wonkiness of that appealing are, 85% progressive. So the people who find that appealing wouldn't like it. And then I think the median conservative would say, this is just a giveaway to coastal elites, and it absolutely is. But it's a giveaway to your coastal elites. So maybe they're the elites you want to give something to. But it is just a fact of life that's kind of how these systems will always work. That it will always be the case that you face these trade-offs. Different jobs have different trade-offs, and that different jobs have different payoffs in financial versus prestige and influence terms.
Well, I like that idea.
And that different belief systems lead you to accept to prefer different sets of those outcomes.
Yeah, well, for all the think tank and policy folks listening to this idea, I hope people take it seriously. Byrne, we're at time. This was an excellent, wide-ranging discussion. As always, until next time.
Yes, indeed. Talk to you next time. Bye.
Thanks for listening to The Riff. Please go follow and subscribe, give us 5 stars, and check out Byrne's excellent newsletter, The Diff, if you haven't already.